Welcome everyone. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation, please send them through the chat function on your Zoom window. We'll monitor the questions as they're being submitted, and we will try to get to as many of them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, to maintain audio quality and to minimize any possible disruptions, all attendees will be muted. If you encounter any technical difficulties, please use the chat function and one of our support specialists will be in touch. Lastly, please note that this session is recorded and will be made available on the Retired Faculty Association website at www.colorado.edu/retiredfaculty. And now, please welcome Dave Korevaar, founding member of the Boulder Campus Retired Faculty Association, for his introductory remarks.
Hi, I'm Dave Korevaar, retired from mechanical engineering in 2008, but busy with an effort to create a Boulder Campus Retired Faculty Association. One of our programs is a series of presentations by distinguished faculty. I'm pleased now to introduce Dean John Davis, a longtime faculty member and administrator in the College of Music and a director of the Thompson Jazz Program. Dean Davis will introduce our today's presenter, Professor David Korevaar.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. As David mentioned, my name's John Davis, and I serve as Dean of the College of Music here at CU Boulder. Today's event features distinguished Professor David Korevaar from the College of Music. David is chair of the Roser Piano and Keyboard Program, professor of piano, and the Helen and Peter Weil Faculty Fellow at the College of Music. He has been hailed by the Washington Post for his wonderfully warm, pliant, and spontaneous playing. David has performed and given master classes throughout the United States, Europe, Asia, and Central and South America. Closer to home, he is a founding member of the Boulder Piano Quartet, which is currently in residence at the Academy in Boulder. He performs regularly with the Toccatas Quartet and recently appeared with them on the Great Performers series at New York's Lincoln Center. Professor Korevaar has an extensive discography of nearly 40 titles with special recognition for his Bach recordings. He has been a dedicated champion of several contemporary composers, having performed and recorded works by many of today's leading composers. In addition to being recognized as a distinguished professor at the University of Colorado, David was honored by the university in 2016 as a distinguished research lecturer, a first in the College of Music. He completed his bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees at the Juilliard School and has won numerous awards, competitions, and prizes. Today, David will be discussing and performing works by Frescobaldi and Clara Schumann. Please join me in welcoming distinguished Professor David Korevaar.
All right, I unmuted myself, but I have this thing here. Let's get rid of that. Okay. I really am very excited to be asked to do this presentation for what is an extraordinary audience of people, and I'm a little bit abashed, quite frankly. I'm sitting here feeling more butterflies than I'm used to as a performer. In any case, I thought I would share with you some stories. And in fact, I decided to title this today, The Stories We Tell, Variations on a Theme. When I was putting together my annual faculty recital for this January, I decided to take advantage of the pandemic and the resultant lack of live performing opportunities. John's introduction reminds me of the fact that I haven't played in front of an actual live audience in a year, to learn some new things. And in choosing my program, I thought up a story of sorts, which started from the one piece on the program I'd played before, Schumann's Symphonic Etudes. That led me to thoughts about techniques of variation, led me to thoughts about virtuosity, fantasy, and subjectivity, all of which are themes of that piece. Here's an old story I've told myself, and I think I've told it to others. Frescobaldi's music isn't suitable for the piano. Conceived as it was for harpsichord or organ, depending on the piece, conceived as it was for tuning systems that create a significantly different sense of color from modern temperament, and written in a musical language that is difficult for modern performers and listeners to come to terms with. I've always lectured on Frescobaldi's keyboard music in my literature classes, emphasizing its historical importance. In particular, Frescobaldi wrote in the preface to the 1637 reissue of his first book of Toccatas about the idea of thinking of his pieces as madrigals. So here's my new story. I'm going to play his Partite, that is variations, on the Romanesca, which I have admired in harpsichord performances, and I've asked a generation of piano students to listen to this music as part of classwork. I'm going to play it on the piano, and to do this, I'm going to have to come to terms with the musical language. I'm going to have to channel Frescobaldi as a keyboard player himself and create a convincing version of this piece on my rather larger instrument. In the early 17th century, notated secular instrumental music was still a novelty. If you needed a dance band, they would improvise on standard bass lines with their associated melodies or standard progressions of chord changes. Sounds a lot like jazz. These were known by various shorthands, names like Romanesca, Ruggiero, Foglia, Passamezzo, Passacaglia, Ciaccona. There was even one that later came to be known as the Frescobalda, for its inventor, Frescobaldi. The Romanesca is one of the simplest of these, consisting of a bass line that goes like this. And I'm going to use my speaking settings, so forgive me, it's not going to sound terrific right now, but. It's usually set in a metrical pattern of 3 beats per note, except that often the first note is extended by a beat. So that ends up being like this. This metrical pattern is often obscured in early 17th century notation by the fact that instead of notating it in triple meter, as it actually is, it's often notated in quadruple meter, with the triple meter simply only evident by looking at the notes themselves. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see what that looks like. Hopefully I can find the right page. All right, and I need to, there we go. So here is the beginning of the piece I'm going to play. And what you'll see is this first B flat lasts 1, 2, 3, 4 beats. And then we move to the F, 1, 2, 3, the G, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then it's very common to reprise the ending of this pattern. So again, we get 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Now that's 2 bare for Frescobaldi, so you can see he fills that all up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So that's a little inside baseball because, of course, if you didn't know that this was in triple meter, you'd never guess from the way it looks on the page. And I'm playing that much faster than it actually goes. This is so attenuated, in fact, that you probably will have a hard time hearing that unless the performer can find ways of emphasizing that aspect of the music. I'll leave this up here for a moment. Actually, I won't. I'm going to stop the share. Even better. Ha! Then I can see everybody or see more people. So, for a composer like Frescobaldi, who did write actual madrigals for the voice, the idea of transferring the freedom of vocal expression to the keyboard was a natural step, even though it's a rather interesting idea in a piece like this. The Italian madrigal of this period was notable for the extensive use of text painting, that is, creating musical figures to illustrate the text in literal or symbolic ways. Rising figures for joy and life, falling figures for sadness and death, you get the idea. It was not unusual for composers of madrigals to use the standard bases that I mentioned earlier in writing their vocal works. There's a famous example by Monteverdi of a Romanesca in his seventh book of madrigals, which was issued in 1619, just a few years after this Frescobaldi piece. I thought I'd give you just a little flavor of what that sounds like. And you'll hear the bass line. The rhythmic arrangement's interesting here because Monteverdi actually mixes it up between 3s and 2s, and you get effectively a lot of 5-beat units. Now these beats are moving relatively slowly, so you may not catch it, but in the meantime, just listen. I'll give you one couplet of this Romanesca by Monteverdi. As I approached learning Frescobaldi's piece, I combined a very subjective, intuitive approach, that is, what did the affect of the local harmony and figuration seem to be, with a more objective and analytical one, how does that affect combine with the underlying metrical structure, which I already showed you. As an example of the kind of intuitive exploration that I tried to do, I thought I would play a couple of examples from the score, and this is just a kind of exploration that I would do with any piece, but here the listening becomes a little harder because the information we have is more limited. And what I want you to do is just kind of hear how the apparent affect of the music will change. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again and put you on back on the score. And I'll start out by looking here at the beginning of this second parte. There's no actual theme here, by the way, because it's just based on bass lines, and you'll hear that he's very free with what happens in the other parts. So at the beginning, we have our B flats and our Fs, and those are harmonized with sounds we recognize as in the world of major. And then we have the G and the D, and those are harmonized. Right? And we all know that major is happy and minor is sad. What's amazing is that that's largely true, and that's one of these sort of cultural touchstones. So as I'm playing this piece, I find myself feeling quite happy. Until there, and suddenly there's this doubt. And this kind of sort of affective thing, which really speaks in the music, is what starts to open up possibilities for interpretation with this. If you simply play these notes in a straightforward manner, the way they look on the page, it's not going to say much to an audience, I think. Just one other example of this kind of thing here in the beginning of this third one, you'll hear how the same shift happens. And here we really have something that feels like a madrigal with these falling scales. And falling lines are often associated with darker emotions, with sadness. So you hear this rather fantastic shifting back and forth that he engages in. One other aspect of the interpretation of this that I want to share with you has to do with something I said earlier. I kind of threw out this idea of trying to come to terms with Frescobaldi as a keyboard player, and that sounds extremely arrogant, but it's something we do, I think, as pianists, because so much of the music we play is native to the keyboard and was written by great keyboard players. And Frescobaldi was one of these. Frescobaldi was known as a virtuoso. So one of the things that we have to do in this music is actually very often arpeggiate chords. And if I'm a pianist and I'm using the pedal, the need for that is not as evident sometimes. So the things that Frescobaldi does with textures, like at the cadences, and I'm looking, say, for example, here, if I did this on the piano and tried to play these chords together without my pedal, let's see if I'm going to be kind of forced into a giant blocky thing right here. And I'm going to have to create spaces. But arpeggiation gives me freedom to connect things that otherwise I wouldn't be able to connect. And I think this is an interesting thing to keep in mind in this music, because the whole sort of nature of arpeggiation is one of the great problems of performance practice in general, and actually through the ages, because arpeggiation is still a part of what we do on keyboard instruments, although sometimes I feel like it's a bit of a lost art. So that's what I was going to say about this. At this point, I'm going to see if I can get my sound settings adjusted properly, and I'm going to go ahead and perform the piece for you. It takes about 12 minutes, I think. I'm not going to make an absolute promise on that because it's pretty subjective, as I said. Make sure my pages are turning. They are. I had a funny conversation with Robert Hill about this. He's impressed that I'm playing this on the piano. And he also said he's never been able to come to terms with these variation sets. He loves Frescobaldi's Toccatas, which are like dreamscapes, he says. And I just feel like, for me, this is so much easier to come to terms with than the Toccatas, which are really wild pieces. This is wild enough for me. Anyway, these are the 14 Partite on the aria of the Romanesca by Girolamo Frescobaldi, composed sometime around 1615, 1614, somewhere in there. Right. I hope everybody could hear that. This is all a little bit of an experiment with Zoom, but I've got myself hardwired in on my Ethernet and everything, so hopefully we did it right. I'm going to go on now and tell a rather different story, a much shorter one with a slightly shorter piece attached to it. I'm going to talk about another piece that I chose for this same program, a piece by Clara Schumann. So here's the story. Clara Schumann, as a woman, was unable to become the composer she might have in a different era. She told herself the story, that a woman couldn't be a composer. We have lots of evidence of that. Her husband, Robert, tried to encourage her. Of course, that didn't matter. She was going off on concert tours between babies, about one a year, that is the babies, not the concert tours, to pay the bills, since Robert wasn't very good at holding a job or making money. I grew up knowing about Clara Schumann without knowing any of her music. And when it became fashionable to promote Clara Schumann because she was that exotic thing, a woman composer in the 19th century, it seemed that her music was promoted not because of its quality, but because she was a woman. The problems of tokenism. This year has been interesting in so many ways, and one is the way in which individually and collectively we have been all re-examining our unconscious biases. I'm in a field in which just about everyone I know was brought up in the belief that composers were white, male, and mostly dead. And there were very few models to contradict that. So, as I said, Clara's own unconscious biases inhibited her. And the biases of the society she lived in and the society that perhaps we still live in have prevented an objective evaluation of her compositional output. So here I am, a supposedly enlightened person who should know better. I'm looking for a romantics variation set to finish out this program I'm putting together, and something that would be from somebody in Schumann's circle. And I thought, well, I should play Mendelssohn's Variation Sérieuse, a piece that's been done plenty. I read through the piece again and I realize I actually don't like it very much. And I know that's heresy and I might bring the ceiling down on my head. I've taught it a number of times. I've certainly looked at it enough. And only after this, only after my knee-jerk recourse to the dead white man, did I remember that there was this marvelous set that I didn't know well enough by Clara. I knew about the piece because I'd studied Brahms's Opus 9 variations a lot, and it's on the same theme. And there's a lovely story about all of that. I'm going to tell you a little bit of it. So part of the story is a story of Clara's love for her husband, Robert, in spite of his quirks, shall we say, some mental instability there, not good at holding a job. There's also a story of Clara, the composer, stymied by convention and her own inhibitions, and the fact that in 1853, when she got around to writing this piece, she hadn't even tried to compose in about 10 years. And a story of Brahms's love for both Schumanns, which is a story for another day. I'm going to share another story, which is a little anachronistic, but I ran across this section. I was reading up on Cécile Chaminade for my piano lit class. And I was looking at the Grove Dictionary, and there was this wonderful little summary of attitudes towards Chaminade's music from critics in the early 20th century. And the summary is, pieces deemed sweet and charming, especially the lyrical character pieces and songs, were criticized for being too feminine, while works that emphasized thematic development were considered too virile or masculine, and hence unsuited to the womanly nature of the composer. This sounds like a pretty no-win game. I had an experience a few weeks ago. I played this, the Clara Schumann piece before I performed it on my faculty recital for a friend of mine who happens to be female, and she expressed some consternation at the virtuosity and virility of certain moments in the piece. And I'm just sort of thinking, we still have these kinds of reactions we don't even know. They're so deeply embedded. So what of the piece itself? These are the variations on a theme by Robert Schumann, by Clara Schumann. They were composed in 1853. A nice romantic story. Clara composed them for her husband's birthday to give them to him as a birthday present. Little did she know that was the last birthday that he would spend with her, because he was about to go off on his self-commitment to a mental hospital. There is a tribute to the young Brahms that Clara made, because she postponed the publication of this piece, which had already been arranged for with Breitkopf and Härtel, in order to be able to promote the publication of Brahms's brand new set, which had been completed a year later. And Clara, following in her husband Robert's compositional footsteps, includes autobiography and personalization. The coda includes a quotation from her own early Romance variée, a piece written when she was 14 years old. And also, that particular theme is one that Robert had used as the basis for his early Opus 5 improvisations on a theme by Clara Wieck. So it was a very interesting connection to make. There's actually another reference to a Robert appropriation of Clara in this piece, I think, but I needn't talk about that. It's so difficult to even approach a piece like this without any of this baggage, right? I'm sort of displaying all the baggage here in a way, and that's probably a dangerous thing to do, but I think it's honest. To realize that this is one of very few pieces by Clara that wasn't composed when she was a teenager. It's a piece that reflects the maturity of a sophisticated musician who has a broad repertoire and broad knowledge of music. I found the process of learning this piece revelatory. It did reinforce what I'd learned from the two other works of Clara I'd played, two chamber pieces, the trio and the romances for violin. She must have had a very unusual technique, and I suspect she had a very large hand based on the way she writes. There are passages here that need to sound effortless, that really put major demands on our Chopin and Liszt trained techniques. My final thoughts is admiration for Clara as a composer, as a master of writing for the piano, and also sadness. After 1853, she essentially gave up on composition altogether, devoting the remaining 43 years of her life to performance and to the protection of her husband's legacy and the promotion of his music. She did perform this piece in public several times. We have evidence for that, which is reassuring at least. I hope you'll agree with me that it's an absolutely marvelous piece. I'm going to go ahead and perform these Clara Schumann variations on a theme by Robert Schumann after I take care of readjusting my settings here.
Bravo, David. We're all clapping silently in our muted fashion here.
The world of Zoom, how we love it.
Yes. I'd like to thank you for that beautiful performance. And while you and I chat for just a minute, I'd like to remind everyone to put any questions that you might have in the chat, and I'll be moderating those. So my name is Andrew Cooperstock. I'm professor of piano. David and I have been colleagues over in the College of Music for about 20 years now. And what you might not know is that we were students together at Juilliard a lot more than 20 years ago. So a really long time ago. Time flies. And I think David would agree with me that at the time, especially, our training was very, I don't know, conservative, let's say. And I would add to mostly learning music by white, male, mostly dead composers, European, probably to that. And within a time frame of maybe, I don't know, 1720 to 1918 or something like that, so pretty restricted. And David, I'd like to congratulate you on, at risk of sounding mushy, your curiosity that we've all noticed, that I've appreciated over these years, because you haven't been afraid to explore other repertoire. And I was wondering if you could tell us what some of that repertoire is in addition to these pieces today, and how it is that you broke out of that mold to have a desire to learn various kinds of music that you've presented over the years.
I guess I never felt like I was, like I had to be in that mold. I had a teacher, Earl Wild, who was known for finding obscure romantic composers and actually recorded quite a few of them over the years. I was also lucky enough when I was a student at Juilliard to also do a minor in composition. And what that meant was that I was around all the composers at Juilliard, some of whom became friends. One in particular, Lowell Lieberman, whose music I've been associated with for many, many years. In fact, those of you who came in at the beginning of the meeting, I guess the random Spotify selection was Lieberman's Eighth Nocturne from a recording of mine. So I've always had that interest. I have to say that this current period has been fascinating to me because it's awakened really how poorly we've done in terms of really looking at what we're looking at when we're looking at this more obscure repertoire. I mean, I know at Juilliard there were always these kind of nerds out there who were very excited about, oh, I don't know, Charvenko one week, or let's see, maybe pieces by Leschetizky or pieces by Lyapunov. I mean, these things would pop up and, oh, look at this, and this is great. All these people were dead white Europeans. And it's interesting. I have this feeling sometimes, as we're looking now at diversifying repertoire, that we already have a major problem because we are not aware of music written after 1918. And I think a lot of our students come to us, and this is one of my frequent gripes, forgive me for repeating it, Andrew, you've heard it before, that students don't want to play anything written after the death of Debussy. Well, that's 1918, it's 2021. I think it's time to drag ourselves kicking and streaming into the world we live in. And yes, there are lots of women and people of color who have written wonderful music. And that's another part of this exploration, which has really come to the fore now. And my friend Chaz Weatherby and I have been doing a lot of exploration of violin and piano repertoire this year because of COVID. We've had lots of time and been putting things together. So a lot of really fascinating and wonderful explorations and discoveries right now. This is kind of the tip of the iceberg, what you're getting today. So thanks, Andrew.
Just terrific. So much music to explore that's more contemporary. But the Frescobaldi, I mean, going back 40 years or so before, Bach, someone might think of that period as sort of old and dusty. I mean, it's hundreds of years old, but I thought that your performance really made it sound very contemporary. And I was wondering if you might like to say something about the freedom of interpretation that you're allowed with old music like that. That's number one, or I shouldn't say old music, but harpsichord music, pre-piano music, what you're allowed to do, what you decide to do. And also a question that came up in the chat was, how is the touch different on the piano? And how does that maybe affect your interpretation of the piece over playing this on the harpsichord?
Well, since I'm not a harpsichordist, I'm not necessarily sure that I can do a good job of talking about that. I do know, I mean, from my little experience with harpsichord, about the pluck, which creates a certain resistance, which is different from the secondary action on the piano that we feel, which is also a kind of resistance. I do think that the arpeggiation issues, which I discussed earlier, kind of fall into that basket. In terms of freedom, actually, this is one of the things that I really emphasize when I'm teaching the piano literature course. And it's one of the reasons that I make a point of talking about repertoire before Bach. So we think of Bach, he's a composer who was active from roughly 1705 until his death in 1750. This Frescobaldi piece is almost 100 years earlier than that. And it was an extraordinary time for the growth of keyboard music as a genre. And there's so many wonderful things that happened. But one of the things that's so interesting are the free pieces, the improvisatory pieces. And it's one of the things that all keyboard composers indulge in from time to time. The French have their unmeasured preludes. Frescobaldi has his Toccatas, as does his student Froberger. And later, Bach has his Toccatas, which represent a continuation of that tradition. I also think a set of baseline variations like this is an obvious precedent for the Bach-Goldberg variations. And I think it's an important thing to think about is the kind of subjectivity that's possible. That is that these pieces, I remember one reviewer criticizing my Bach-Goldberg variations for the fact that I didn't keep a unified tempo. Well, nobody does. Let's be real, not in the Goldbergs. But the fact is, the piece was probably never expected to be played as a whole anyway, in spite of its obvious architecture. And I think we have to look at these things and we have to characterize them. The challenge with Frescobaldi is that his way of characterizing, as I tried to show, because he's thinking about sort of madrigal style, things change very quickly. It's like Mozart opera, right? You've got somebody who's happy and then the cloud passes over for, 2 seconds and they're sad and then they're happy again. And that's what a lot of music does. And I think it demands of us a response. So, taking off from Frescobaldi's own comments about handling his music like a madrigal, I think it's fair enough to sort of say there's lots of room. And there's certainly other writers from the period who talk about this.
I thought that your shaping of the lines was so beautiful, and the tonal color and so on. And does your interpretation come from the idea of singing the lines, or?
Well, yes, it does. It's actually something I do myself and something I tell my students to do. Sometimes it happens when you're actually recording the piece and then you hear it coming back at you and you realize, no, I shouldn't be singing now. Andrew and I have a teacher in common, Abby Simon, who was quite well known for his groaning. And it does come through on a lot of his recordings. I've found myself, if I listen with headphones carefully to some of my own recordings, that there's a certain amount of groaning that happens. It can be kind of hard to avoid. We're feeling the music.
Exactly. We have to stop in just a minute, but there's a couple questions from one of your students who is here that we can all see. And so one is, he'd like you to comment on using music for the Frescobaldi. And actually, Pedro has put it in a special way. Is that a piece that should not be performed from memory? Maybe you can say something about sort of what was common at the time. And whoa, sorry.
Happens to the best of us. I turned my phone off.
That was my iPad. My phone is off. So maybe you could say something about memory. And then he'd also like you to just mention something about your interpretive choices in terms of, he says, agogic choices.
Yeah, I can see the
which you can see there as well. So
absolutely. So I love this question. Is that the kind of music that shouldn't be performed from memory? I'm not sure there's any music that should or shouldn't be performed from memory, but I do think there's validity to the question because it's funny, and this was a conversation I had with Robert Hill just a couple of days ago. He asked me, "Did you memorize the Frescobaldi?" I said, "No, I couldn't. I couldn't possibly." And the reason I can't is because of this this sort of dreamlike unfolding of the piece. I mean, I suppose I could if I spent time on it, but it would take a lot of effort and time to do it. The logic of the piece is not one that seems to really give itself to memory. Should it be memorized or should it not be memorized? I feel like with the music, I have more freedom here with the score in front of me. And I think with a piece like the Clara Schumann, I have more freedom without the score in front of me. But that's a totally subjective judgment, and it has to do with the way my brain and learning process works. I think one of the things we're learning is that one of the givens of Andrew's and my conservative conservatory education is that everything is always memorized when you're a pianist, right? And I think we are finally learning, and Andrew has been in the forefront of this, I give him credit, but we are finally learning that that's silly. And these are artificial practices. The love of memorization is something that happened in the 19th century. Actually, we have Clara Schumann to blame for that in part. She was one of the people who made a point of it. And yeah, so that's, I guess that's kind of answering it. The agogic choices, that's a long lecture, my God. Pedro and I can talk about that one privately. But the short answer is yes.
That sounds good. I tell you what, we're almost out of time. There's one more question by Kieran Buer, one of our graduates. Why don't you take that one there? I think we can see that, and then we will wrap up.
Yeah. So actually, Karen, I was going to talk about this, but I actually have a suspicion that the major key variation, which is the one that also gets the Romance Variée theme at the end, when it first appears. This shape is the shape of the thematic material that Schumann borrows from Clara and is at the center of his F minor piano sonata, which has a set of variations in the middle with exactly the same melodic contour, slightly different rhythmic presentation. And I have a feeling that Clara did that on purpose. I think and it's quite marvelous because then in the coda, she actually combines two pieces of material that Schumann borrowed from her. So that's the one reference that I know, but if Karen knows of another one, I'd love to know about it. She can share that with me privately, but it's certainly possible.
Well, thank you for sharing today, and I've enjoyed our chat. We should do it more often. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Well, we're delighted that you could perform for us and give us a little history lesson. I'm going to send you an email with a question that I had, which I don't think I sent properly, so that Andrew didn't get it. But I'm curious as to whether somebody listening to the Schumann piece for the first time would recognize the emotion in it without knowing anything about Clara Schumann's bio.
I think yes. I mean, I think the piece doesn't really need a story, which was maybe the ironic subtext of everything I told you about it. And it's one of the things that's really hard there, because there is a story and it's irresistible to tell it. And I only told a small portion of it.
I want to thank Bob Grossman, Kim Malville for doing all the hard work and setting this all up, to say nothing of Kai Young Wolf, our technology expert, who put the whole thing together. And it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's been a wonderful success. Thanks to all of you who participated in this, and I hope we'll be able to do these kinds of things more often.